which isn't nothing.
No, no, that's right. So do all economists have no feelings?
They're they're basically trained not to.
Yeah, I know. I'm just
It doesn't really take.
no. Well,
But I have seen some fairly disturbing studies of MBA graduates that suggest that MBA graduates are materially higher on psychopathy than
really,
MBA inductees. Yes.
really,
Uh,
I was only kidding.
yeah. Well, unfortunately, we live in the world that we live in, and
Yeah.
and uh, the I think it's the McGudridge's principle or something like that, that you can't satirize the real world because anything you can think of is not only real, it's worse than that.
Welcome, everybody. We're going to do part 2 today of the history of money and finance with Noah Healy. Last time we touched on a lot, but it's up to you, sir. We there's so much to unearth from this economics topic, but where did you want to go today with this?
Well, what I think the most productive thing to do would be actually to dive into game theory, theory of mind, and sort of go recursive on the discipline a little bit and learn about like what economics is even capable of being. One of the names for economics in academia for years was the dismal science, because basically for centuries they just said, you know, here's how things are, and it's crappy, but what are you going to do?
Okay. Yeah.
and and that gets into a little bit of the fact that while economic systems are sort of obviously built by mankind,
Mm-hmm.
um, the systems predate economics as a discipline. And so what's going on here is that uh, as societies have become more sophisticated and wealthier, we have developed more and more sophisticated lifestyles, and we've sort of started to examine those lifestyles as part of our lifestyles.
Right.
um,
Yeah.
and so the economics profession is sort of that aspect of humanity's operation. And just as with a person can sort of become addicted to reading self-help books without actually doing any of the self-help,
Yeah.
or or going off with some guru that's basically spouting nonsense and being exploited. Um, uh, there's a huge amount of things that people who have re-examined their lives and tried to figure out how to live them better have come up with, and most of them, at least from the outside, have been transparently nonsensical, to the point where when you see these things, you can't imagine how anybody bought into it in the first place.
Okay.
But that's the same essentially as what's going on with economics as a discipline, attempting to do that same sort of thing for sort of humanity as a whole, except it's not even the advantage of having, like, at least you have the experience of being yourself and you have the capacities of being yourself if you decide to sit down and try to fix something about or consider something about your own life.
Right.
This would be like if a few cells in your intestines decided to go on a meditation retreat and figure out like how your entire life should be better.
Okay, that's a great analogy. I like it. So, what is game theory, and then what's game of mind?
So game theory was developed in the 20th century, and it's the mathematics of interacting agents. And so this actually moves economics from a narrative story-based discipline,
Right.
where in the 19th or 18th centuries, people would, in many cases, literally make up stories about what they were talking about. So things like the broken window fallacy, where Bastiat tells the tale of a baker who has a brick thrown through his window, and so he has to go to the glazier in town and buy a new window, and then the glazier takes that money and goes to the cobbler and buys his children some new shoes, and the cobbler takes that money and goes to the thatcher and gets a new roof, and the sort of the tale eventually comes back to, like a farrier going into the bakery and buying some, donuts. And so this entire cycle of economic activity has occurred.
Mm-hmm.
And so the tale, as Bastiat puts it, the sort of simpleton would see all this activity and say, oh, breaking the window made economic activity happen. Sort of breaking windows is good. and Bastiat, in the essays in That Which Is Seen and That Which Is Unseen, says, wait a minute, okay, all that happened. The economic activity was all good. But imagine a world where the brick didn't go through the window. The baker has the money to buy a new window. He's not just going to eat it or shoot it into space. He's going to buy something else that he wants. And while the other thing that he wants isn't going to come specifically from the glazier, that whole chain of craftsmen and shopkeepers and so on in town, it's going to run through them again in some form or fashion. And so in this new story, which sadly didn't happen, effectively all that economic activity happens, plus the baker still has a window. So we're even better off in the world where we don't just smash windows to get people to fix them to have an economy.
Okay.
So we go from a stage where economics is sort of trying to construct materialist parables about how the world functions, with some leavening of morality. There's some efforts to try to remove the moral questions for some people, and other people are try very hard to kind of stick morality into the systems. But once we get to game theory, things become much more rational, which doesn't necessarily drain the morality out of it, or necessarily inject more in, but it does mean that we can structure things in a form that allows us to think about stuff that the narrative forms actually work against us. And that's where theory of mind starts coming in. So theory of mind is essentially like empathy. It's the ability to conceptualize the thoughts of another person. Autistics generally score very low on theory of mind. And the sort of classic demonstration of theory of mind is the film cliche of the person under threat who transforms their face into a shocked face in order to get somebody to look over their shoulder. That works on people who have theory of mind. You see somebody become very scared, you say to yourself, oh, they are scared. What is scaring them suddenly? I can't see what that is. It must be something that is behind me. So I am thinking about what you are thinking and evaluating that. That is second order theory of mind. And people that don't have that don't react to people who are suddenly terrified or fascinated or anything else, because they cannot consider what another person might be thinking. And in stories, human beings in their sort of regular lives can handle a few degrees of theory of mind. So you can see somebody react to somebody changing expression and understand what's going on. So in order to watch this scene and make sense of it, you need third order theory of mind. And in order to tell a story about a person understanding, you need fourth order theory of mind. And in order to criticize that, it would sort of grow out and out. And if you think about the stories that people interact with, large numbers of characters continually interacting in ways that require deep understanding of how all the other characters are behaving are very rare. One of the most sophisticated stories is one of my favorite Shakespeare plays, Much Ado About Nothing, where we have, are you familiar with the play?
Not really, no.
We have two characters who are sort of cynical. They're both a little world weary, and they're really witty. They're sort of the main characters of the piece, and they have a lot of verbal back and forth whenever they meet each other as the guy and gal, and they basically both sworn off love and marriage, and their best friends are these sort of two young, innocent, beautiful people, and they're in love and they're going to get married. And so the guy who's the boss of the two guys, our sort of ornery protagonist and our lovelorn, young guy, comes up with a plan with the to-be betrothed couple to manipulate the other couple to get them to fall in love with each other.
Okay.
And the plan is to have each of the ornery people overhear one of the lovelorn people talking to one of their confidants about how the other ornery person is actually deeply in love with them, but because of the long history, can't actually admit it. And so they need the other person to sort of break through and seduce them before they can actually do anything. So they're both like set up that they need to like seduce this other person who's really in love with them. And so this is a complicated little story.
Right.
But including the writer, there's only 6 people involved here. Shakespeare is writing the prince, getting hero and, to manipulate, and that's only 6 people. There aren't any economies with only 6 people in them. So one of the most sophisticated, like, narrative theory of mind tales that human beings have produced is millions of times too small to cope with the sort of actual scope and scale of what's going on. And so this gets into the issues of economics needing to take that next step, to always try to look into that other side of things. And with this mathematical tool, while it's hard to wrap your head around a situation where dozens or hundreds of people are all interacting with each other, the math gives us a system where we can potentially, at least, turn that into sort of a really big accounting problem, where we can sort of check off, okay, this interaction works like this, okay, this interaction works like this. And so we don't have to sort of conceptualize everything, because what the math is keeping track of will actually help control some of those issues. And so that's where we've seen a lot of failing in the prescriptive end of things by economists, where they've sort of built out these models based on these things that, you know, just existed before they got there.
Right.
And they don't do this sort of empathic, deep connection, and then leave something out. And so we were talking about inflation before, and sort of the progress of inflation through the economy, and how we've sort of largely redefined inflation to just be the bad part that people don't like, and specifically the people that cause the inflation don't like, the part where they actually have to start raising people's salaries to pay for all the lying that they did. One of, if not the primary driver of inflation that we're experiencing right now, goes to the global financial crisis. And that is very directly one of these cases where the sort of the game theory wasn't done, and that sort of next step, or the unseen part, wasn't actually taken account of. So we can kind of walk through where that and how that happened, I think. Okay. And you know, so are you familiar with The Big Short, like the movie or the film?
Yes.
Okay, so there'll be some overlap between, you know, like what I'm talking about and what they talked about, because it's the same subject essentially. Yeah. But basically, Wall Street came up with this mathematical formalism for diversifying their investments across the credit markets for housing. And as a result of that, they lowered credit standards.
Okay.
Because
why did they do that?
So the diversification is essentially a risk management tool. So if you go in and make a bet in a casino, maybe you'll win and maybe you'll lose.
Okay.
If you make two bets, maybe you'll win twice, maybe you'll lose twice. But more often than either of those things, you'll probably win one, lose one.
Right. So
if you make 1,000 bets, then you're probably going to get pretty close to whatever the house edge is, where, you know, you sort of win 490 and lose 510 or something like that. And so the more bets you make, the closer to the average performance that you'll actually do. on a relative basis. And so diversification is a pretty standard technique to use for risk management.
Right.
So why did it fail? You've got this thing that works really well. Why are we now living in a world where if governments don't spend trillions of dollars that they don't have every year, the entire economy will collapse? And we've been this way for a decade.
Mm-hmm.
Well, basically for two reasons. Number one, the basic diversity story rests on the proposition that the landscape of possibilities is normal. So you might have heard of long tail or fat tail or black swan type events. Mm-hmm. I don't have to, let's say I'm offering you gambling games. I don't have to offer you gambling games that behave normally. I can.
Yeah.
You know, like we could have a fair coin. You flip the coin. If heads comes up, I'll give you $100. If tails comes up, you give me $110. Mm-hmm. Like I'm going to make money long term doing this. Short term, maybe I don't. You get a few heads in a row, you're going to get a few $100. But long term, heads and tails even out. I'm getting an extra $10 every time. I'm going to do okay. But I don't have to design a game that works like that. I could create a game where instead of flipping one coin, you're going to flip, say, 10 coins. And if any of them come up heads, I'll give you $100. But if they all come up tails, you owe me $1 billion.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
That's going to take a really, really long time to normalize comparatively.
Yes.
And I can structure other games that have, even worse types of mechanics. You could die if something goes wrong, stuff like that. Like, mm-hmm. So normality is a really good general thing for many, many situations, but not every situation is normal. And risk management in unnormal situations is really, really different from risk management in normal situations, because let's say you're doing this, kind of thing where you're diversifying, and one of the things you're diversifying into is one of these crazy, it's not a fixed amount of money, it's just you're bankrupt type deals. Well, that's an incredibly dangerous thing to be involved in.
Right.
And it doesn't matter sort of how much or how little you're involved in it, because it's just automatically bankrupting you if it breaks. Mm-hmm. And so any admixture of that into your portfolio is now your entire portfolio is at risk.
So why did they decide at that time to diversify more? I mean, was it new or not new, or just it collapsed and they just?
Well, so that gets into the question of like why it broke.
Right.
So the problem wasn't so much that they decided to diversify their risk in loan offerings. The problem was that they then decided to use that as the input for their credit offering arm. So banks were lending money to people to buy houses.
Yeah.
And their willingness or unwillingness to lend money was based on the credit risk that they were going to absorb from having the loan, mm-hmm. and the value of the house. So then they did something that caused their credit risk to collapse.
What was that?
That was the diversification.
Okay.
So suddenly I give you a loan, I have a risk. Maybe you're a deadbeat. Maybe you'll get sick. Maybe something will go wrong with you.
Right.
But I give 10,000 people loans and change the structure so that I'm not considering them as individuals, but as sort of tiers of a new 10,000 thing, and suddenly I have virtually no risk at all. So what am I doing sitting on all this money? Why don't I give out some more loans? Why don't I give out bigger loans?
So it started to reveal itself when people stopped paying their mortgage. Is that when that happened? And what was the result?
No. We're not even there yet.
Okay.
So because the willingness of banks to loan money was based on two things. One, the risk that they were assessing, which has now collapsed, and two, the value of the houses that they were giving loans on. As they were willing to offer larger loans that were a larger fraction of the underlying value of the houses, that meant that people who wanted to buy houses were now free to bid up the cost of houses, which meant that now, in addition to the banks being more willing to give loans and less concerned over the validity of the deal, the housing market itself was being pumped up by these new loan amounts. And so inflation, like I said, inflation starts in the asset class, and nobody objects to it when it's happening there, which is unfortunate, because like that's when you could actually fix things. So that's where essentially the entire housing market became much, much more expensive than it ought to have been in a world where we didn't produce enormous amounts of inflation.
Are we there? We're there again, yeah.
We never left.
Right.
So we would have left if America's housing stock dropped in value to approximately what it had been in the early 90s. That never happened. Right.
Okay. And so how could that have happened?
Liquidation. The Lehman Brothers failure, the Bear Stearns implosion. They could have stayed on the sidelines, and the government could have said, boy, that sucks. I guess some of you are criminals. We will step in and arrest them. And the banks would have failed. There would have been some interesting issues because my understanding is that the depository reserve was underfunded. And at any rate, large amounts of money are held outside of the secured depository, accounts in any event. Enormous amounts of American nominal wealth would have vanished. And the basic argument at the time was that society would simply have disintegrated in the face of that. The people in Congress giving after-action reports like a year or so later were told, said that they were told that there would have been tanks in the streets to maintain public order if the financial system was actually called to account for what it had done. We didn't do that, so I don't know whether or not that's what would have happened.
Exactly.
What we did instead was deficit spent $1 trillion+ a year and removed congressional oversight and authority from things like the overnight lending rate for the banks to allow the federal bureaucracy, the Fed, and the banks to give themselves a liquidity reservoir that appears to have no bottom. And as a result of that, inflation continued. Not so much at that point continuing to prop up the housing market at the rates that it had been, although lots of housing is still quite expensive across the world. But a lot of that wound up flowing into the stock market, bond markets, other things, and propping those things up instead.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. So when you say flowing into those, what do you mean by that exactly?
Money is frequently described as liquidity or in liquid metaphors.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a pretty good analogy, because the sort of entire point of money is that
Yeah.
it sort of takes on the shape of its container. Like you can turn money into food or labor or
Yeah.
land or whatever, by simply buying that. And since all these things are negotiable in monetary values,
So some things are more liquid than others. Yes.
so particular assets are described as more and less liquid, for their convertibility.
Right.
So something that's like widely traded, somebody might decide to, say, buy an enormous amount of silver or aluminum or gold or something like that, as an asset, and sit on it for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And since those things are all basically durable, though the physical object will still exist in essentially the same state later in time, and they're in general demand, so you can sell them back off again. Those would be highly liquid assets. Assets that are hard to sell on demand would be fairly illiquid assets. So family businesses, the works of the old masters, stuff that's complicated to value.
Yeah. So so like a house, for example,
Houses are between these extremes. They're in terms of things that people tend to think of as investment assets, they're on the illiquid side of those. But in terms of assets in general, houses are relatively liquid, still over on the liquid side of things. Pretty much all investment assets are on the liquid side of things,
right.
To a fairly decent degree.
Right. Do you know much about the personal home being a tool for the banks? I mean, is that an accurate statement? We sell this idea to everybody that you should have a house and that's an asset, and on the rest of it that comes with it. Is that true, that that's where it started, as a tool to hook you in with the bank?
Well, so that gets a little weird, actually. Personal homes are something that we can read about in like the days of Rome or Athens, but the home as an economic unit has been undergoing a lot of changes. There's a great series of videos that the British Heritage Foundation put together, where they have actors showing you what a Victorian household operates as. And it's sort of the servants, it's downstairs, so it's like the people doing the actual work. Mm-hmm. And the thing is, in this day and age, the kind of urban conveniences that we see as relatively normal don't exist. Like, ubiquitous Starbucks and cleaners and gyms and stuff like that. Those don't exist. Grocery stores, as we understand them, don't exist. And so these people have gardens with greenhouses, mm-hmm, so that they can eat exotic delicacies. Because to grow lemons in England in the 1900s, is a difficult task, because if you're just out, in the Scottish Highlands, the winter will kill them. So, having a place in the right part of the country that's got a greenhouse that has guys that go in and take care of the plants on a regular basis is what it takes in order to be able to eat a lemon meringue pie. And they have laundresses, they have a laundry, and they own several houses, and those houses have maybe 100 servants in all of them, and all of those people wear clothes, and all those clothes need to be cleaned on some sort of basis. Well, there isn't a laundromat with machines like those haven't been invented yet. So they have a group of people whose job it is to clean clothes, and they clean everybody's clothes. They have cooks and different specialties, and so on and so on. So the entire house is an economic unit. It's a business, essentially.
Yeah.
We are in the early stages of the urbanization experiment. I think the world flipped over from being majority rural to majority urban sometime in the 80s, maybe late 70s, something like that. And even America, which is fairly urbanized, I think our flip over point was in like the 70s or something. Homes have largely ceased to be economic units. We are now flirting with sort of going back to that. The COVID lockdowns led to a great number of people working from home, not certainly everybody or even most people. Many people have jobs that require attendance, nurses, car mechanics, grocery baggers cannot work from home. But the home as sort of a rest and repose and almost a vacation spot, which is essentially the sort of suburban idyll that Leave It to Beaver and that sort of message put together, is a ridiculous thing in human history, which might be practical, but I'm not so certain that banks like floated and built the idea versus simply took shameless advantage of the existence of the idea to make an enormous amount of money. And so, yeah, I'm sure that they were more than happy to glom on and amplify the message, but at its core, it's a very attractive one.
Yeah.
This notion that you would have a place of your own, which was constructed around your leisure, essentially, is, there's an epic poem in Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree. Like, it's insane that we have decided that the typical middle class family should have the perquisites of an Oriental dictator that conquered the world. But it's pretty awesome if we can figure out how to make it work.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a hell of a concept, right? I mean,
right.
And so much comes from that. I mean, it's so a part of the culture. I mean, it's just, anyway, it was felt off for me, but it certainly didn't for my wife. But
yeah, so the thing I think that really goes the step too far is also deciding that it's an investment.
Right.
So the concept that ordinary citizens should have access to a pleasure palace, I think, is awesome, and I see the appeal and the attraction,
Yeah.
and if a coherent mechanism to allow that to actually exist can be structured, and that's what people want to do with their money and their lives, I'm more than happy for them,
Yeah.
us, to have access to that. But to also claim that you should be paid for having a pleasure palace is, I believe, a step too far.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
Uh,
yeah. I mean, I guess maybe that's just what's the word? People trying to make the best of their situation. What's there's a word I'm trying to think of. I can't think of, but we're getting off on a tangent here, but since we're on one, I wanted to talk to you about universal basic income because it came up with somebody else I was talking in Clubhouse about. I'm curious, what I mean, are you familiar with the topic? Like, are you
yeah.
pretty familiar with it? I mean, you know what it is, obviously, but I mean, in the sense that, is there a long-term benefits um, to the economic, less cost of things versus the way we're doing it now, which is,
Well, so this in some extent feeds into the sort of inflation story and
yeah,
this
yeah,
sort of not second stage thinking that, I mean, is sort of the motif and theme of what we're talking about. The foremost problem with universal basic income as proposed is humans have the ability to get used to things.
uh-huh.
And we have sort of inbuilt continuity, if you will. So one of the sort of bizarre artifacts uh, of public policy is the death rates on American highways, which recently have finally changed, but for several decades, through many different tweaks of safety, different levels of travel, different degrees of actual highwayization and ability to travel and so on,
Mhm.
highway deaths were about 40,000 a year.
Yeah.
And they were just about 40,000 a year. Like, you put in new regulations and make everything a lot safer, they don't change. You get rid of the regulations and decide people should just and they don't change. Because to a large extent, the rate at which severe accidents or death or stuff like that occurs is based on the voluntary self-exposure to danger of individual human beings. And
Mm-hmm.
human beings have this danger sense of how dangerous do I think things are. And so if you put crash helmets on everybody in order to keep them safer,
Mm-hmm.
they'll say, oh, I'm safer, I can drive more like a maniac now.
Yeah.
I can drive enough more like a maniac that I feel as dangerous as I used to feel when I didn't have a mandated crash helmet on. And that's essentially what happened, is that, people put on seatbelts, didn't really change the numbers very much.
Right.
People started enforcing seatbelt laws, didn't really change the numbers that much. They raised, speed limits.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter. COVID has really changed habits quite a lot, and highway deaths are now in fact way up
Yeah.
on a per mile basis. So that's a little weird, but I think total driving is way down. So there's just been some actual movement, but this sort of habituation tendency of humanity is a real counterweight to any sort of broad change and policy thing, particularly for something like universal basic income. Right now, the prices that are charged for food, shelter, water, power, entertainment are based on people having the amount of money that they have. If everybody has $10,000 more a year, $20,000 more a year, $30,000 more a year, all of those prices will rapidly alter.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
In order to even consumption out,
right,
for those things, and the best guess would be that people's lifestyles would not significantly alter from their present condition.
I guess the safety and safety net, I guess, you know, you can bring some people out of poverty, you know, and that's where a lot of, you know, cost is, right? And
that's the argument. But again, habituation, there's zero evidence that habituation doesn't also apply to living in poverty.
Okay. Yeah, fair.
And so the safety net, to some extent, actually needs to exist in community. It's not a personal thing. It's a ability to fall back on the group thing. Mm-hmm. And those groups are limited in their scope and size by our personal capacity to be empathetic to the people who are around us, to strangers and so on. And there you're, you know, almost getting into the religious end of things, of whether or not we should become better people or not. And if we know what better people are, then there's a reasonable argument to be made that we should do that. But there's a lot of arguments.
There's a lot of arguments
to get through before you get to that presupposition.
Yeah.
So the most probable outcome of any general UBI type scheme would be hardcore habituation and almost complete scrubbing of that from what's going on. Okay. And I've thought, I have, you know, like I thought about this like a decade ago. If you were going to do such a thing and you didn't want habituation to just sort of utterly ruin it almost instantly, what you'd have to do, in my opinion, is actually make it stochastic and impactful. So rather than, say, having a $10,000 a year check cut to every man, woman, and child,
right,
you have a lottery.
Okay.
That 1% of men, women, and children win, and you get $1 million.
Okay.
And so you get the same amount of money over your lifetime on average, but some people will get more. Some people will never get anything. But that's a thing that's out there. And you know, that'd be like $10,000 a year if it's like UBI and some sort of multiple of the poverty line or whatever, you know, or it's supposed to be more than that. Right. The current figure, I believe the APA uses for an American life based on sort of average total economic value produced over the course of an American lifespan is $5 million. So if your UBI is greater than that, then you're going to have some problems paying for things.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
But some sort of system like that, where sort of everyone has a chance of wealth, so but not in any way that you could depend upon in any real fashion,
Okay.
would work against habituation, and maybe create something that would be a little harder to cope with. But I mean, you could easily, there are today, people who win the lottery get very different junk mail than you and I get, and that's a part of the nature of things, is going after them. There's all sorts of niche sales things in the financial markets to try to gather in particular kinds of money. And so if a UBI existed, whatever would replace payday loan and check cashing places that would be able to exploit UBI participants, somebody would invent that thing.
Fair enough. Yeah.
And people would replicate that invention until they were getting all of that money.
Okay.
Because that would be there for them to get.
Okay. Got it. I never thought of it that way. That's good. Thank you. Yeah.
Well, again, this is what sort of the real economic thinking, and sort of the theory of mind, I think, is, it's good to keep that in mind, not because you'll sort of suddenly be able to write like Dickensian narratives of all these different shifting perspectives working together or something, but just recognizing that there's sort of always this one deeper level, and so many of the very public disasters which have occurred are sort of very obviously the result of people doing really just, it's never even two level thinking. It's always one level thinking. It's always like, oh, look, bad thing happening. What if I just opened up a money spigot or made illegal or something else to stop that specific bad thing I see?
Yeah. Well, maybe it's also, maybe they don't have any other options. I don't, being the devil's advocate, and maybe in their shoes, we have to fix this right now, like in 2008. I mean,
well,
I don't know.
So there's aspects of that. There's a quote from Yes Minister, something must be done. This is something, therefore this must be done.
Yes.
That's a pretty disastrous approach
for sure
to living.
No, I agree.
Yeah.
Well, something in life, there's this thing where sometimes you can overanalyze things, right? And you don't ever get anything done, right? And that's been something in my life where, like, sometimes I just have to choose something, but I understand.
So it is true. Yes, action is ultimately necessary, but I would argue that for the shallowness that is being engaged in, and in many cases not to fix immediate crises, like I was saying before, the global financial crisis was not set off because half of Americans were homeless or something, during the 90s boom under Bill Clinton, that the American economy was so disastrous and so poverty ridden that the banks simply had to step forward and come up with a radically new way to, like, that's not remotely what happened. They did some math and figured out this thing that if they did it, they'd make more money.
And
So they
that's
were like, okay, I will now make more money.
so is that it? Is that it, man? Like that's the motive. They sit in a room, they have a think tank, and they decide how do we make more money? I mean, I guess.
Have you ever, worked
Thought
for a
of this.
business or been in one?
Yes. Yes. How do we make more money?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I mean, it's a reasonably common thing, and at small scale, uh, with moral constraints, it's fine. If the guy that's the village shopkeeper thinks that putting, Aunt Rose's tea cakes in the front of the shelf are going to sell him better, and he's right, then that's great. People wanted Aunt Rose's tea cakes. There they are. It's all good. Um, if he changes the food pyramid and makes it so that children aren't allowed to leave school until after they've eaten 40 Aunt Rose's tea cakes, then, then we've got problems.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the issues that we have now today that didn't previously exist, is that since globalized communication and transportation are ubiquitous and cheap, something that makes somebody money at a low scale, but might be immoral or might not scale up, will nevertheless become universally scaled, just because of the competitive landscape. So in agriculture, for example, there's a strong counter movement to the factory farm thing. But the factory farm thing isn't because, like some group of evil maniacal Satanists decided to get into agriculture. It's because each step of the way, they were looking at the situation and saying to themselves, if I do this, the ROI from my field goes up.
That's right. Yeah, and there's there's demand, and that's why capital works, and that's how we make progress as a culture. Curious, like you always have people that look up at the whatever it is, the corporations you're talking about, or anything that they see as the ivory tower and say, oh, they must be evil up there. I mean, that's just silly, right? It's just people like you and I trying to solve a problem. Would you agree with that?
I don't think you should dismiss that automatically, but I don't think you should go to it either. There is some fairly disturbing evidence that psychopathy is related to corporate success and business success.
Awesome.
Probably it is.
Well, no, I mean, like, probably it is, yeah. But I mean, why is that in that culture? I mean, it's in every culture, but I mean, why are these? Why is it that the culture of stepping on other people's toes in the corporate setting is how you get ahead? Like what? And I've seen it firsthand in companies like Procter and Gamble, for example. And that is the culture that's bred throughout. And I don't know if it is.
So to go back now to game theory, one of the sort of basic problems that we're coping with in economics is that we're trying to measure things that are fundamentally immeasurable. So value is a completely personal thing.
Sure it is.
You and I, you're probably not allergic to apples. I've never run anything that is. I like apples. You probably like apples. There's essentially no chance that we like apples exactly the same amount. And that's just apples. Like, who even cares about apples? So,
Yeah.
so we've got 8 billion people wandering around. Most of us don't know most of us. None of us, in fact, know most of us.
Yeah,
We all have opinions.
we do.
What structure of what could be matches to the best possible extent the opinions of the 8 billion of us?
Yeah, that's right.
Or what
Yeah.
if I just took what I wanted and the rest of you just kind of coped with it?
Well, and there is that happening too.
And so, under those circumstances, competition and cooperation and other forms of interaction, just indifference, all exist in a mix and mesh. And game theoretically, they are very, very different things. And we have gotten to a point where we exalt competition as the measurement of this basically immeasurable thing, which means that we're insane and wrong because it's basically unmeasurable. So no the measurement could possibly exist.
Hmm.
Um, so we have this story around competition. Competition breeds innovation. Competition makes winners. Well, that's false. Competition makes losers. That's its value.
How so? Oh, I see. Yeah, yeah, okay. But explain it.
So yes, so the problem we had is that there's 8 billion of us that all have our crazy opinions, but
Yeah.
we can't do 8 billion different things. We need to team them up. We need groups to do stuff.
Hmm.
So we need to toss out some of the bad opinions. Well, we need to toss out some of the opinions. Hopefully we will toss out opinions that are worse and keep opinions that are better.
Hmm.
And so competition's the mechanism. Competition makes losers. It tosses out some of those opinions and
Sure.
leaves us with some of the other ones. The people that are left over from competition, the winners, aren't necessarily good. So
Right.
I could create a competition where we roll dice against each other. No skill is involved. It's just random. Somebody's still going to win.
Yeah.
And even if I have a competition that is along some sort of metric of potential, like the Olympics, for example,
Yeah.
people win the Olympics without setting world records or even Olympic records,
Sure.
or even, doing particularly well for that sport that year.
Yeah.
You have the competition and somebody gets a gold medal. Period.
Yeah.
Somebody's always going to get that gold medal. If
Yeah.
everyone in the Olympic 100 gets stomach flu the day before and they have to scrape somebody out of the track and field thing to go out there and run the races from their teams,
That's an
that
experiment.
guy will win the Olympic gold medal that year. And there actually was a case, I saw a clip of this. I think it might have been a guy from Polynesia or something, but somehow there was a guy where the person who was supposed to be running the race just was totally unavailable, injury, something. And so they'd gotten this other person from their Olympic team to be in the 100 meters. And he had the build of a weightlifter. And he clocked this isn't the final heat, obviously. This is
No.
one of the qualifiers, but he clocked a 12-second time in the Olympics. He lost,
Yeah.
but he lost because that was the only team that happened to.
Right.
If somehow every single team got totally wiped out,
Yeah.
then some guy who can only run that 100 in 11 seconds could get a gold medal, because of the people that were competing there that day, he'd be the one. So that's what competition is actually good for. And so the value proposition of competition is mostly quality control,
Okay. Yeah. So,
which
so
isn't nothing.
no, no, that's right. So do all economists have no feelings?
They're they're basically trained not to.
Yeah, I know. I'm just
It doesn't really take.
no. Well,
But I have seen some fairly disturbing studies of MBA graduates that suggest that MBA graduates are materially higher on psychopathy than
really?
NBA inductees. Yes.
Really?
Uh,
I was only kidding.
yeah. Well, unfortunately, we live in the world that we live in, and
Yeah.
and uh, the I think it's the McGudridge's principle or something like that, that you can't satirize the real world because anything you can think of is not only real, it's worse than that.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. Yeah, no, and I do a lot of that. I project onto other things, right? Because I mean, the way I see it, and I might, this goes back to my comment about, the culture of stepping on people's toes. But I mean, I look at it as when I'm gonna die, I'm not gonna think of, I'm gonna think of things like who did I fuck over in my life to get where I am, and I'm gonna feel bad about it. I'm gonna be like, because and I don't know. I've never been there, but I'm assuming that's how it is because I heard other people talk about they were with their loved one and they'd have this, this, um, last words or I'm sorry for this, sorry for that. I don't know. So
well, have you ever heard Johnny Cash's take on hurt?
no, well maybe I don't know. Sure.
So hurt was it Nine Inch Nails?
Yeah, they did.
Trent Reznor. Yeah. So they did that. Johnny Cash, it might have been the last song he ever recorded. He died fairly shortly afterwards. Covered the song "Hurt," and uh, Reznor heard heard about it, didn't regard it much. Finally, got to listen to it a few years later after Cash was dead, and was basically like, you know, that's insane, that's incredible, that's it's his song basically at this
Yeah.
point.
Yeah.
And it's still goes viral every once in a while.
Oh, yeah.
And basically that was Cash's take on that song, is sort of doing it as his deathbed regrets and apology
Mm-hmm.
for his life, more or less.
Yeah.
And he's Johnny Cash, like he can put that into his voice and have it come through. So it's really devastating.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, some people don't have consciences.
Yeah, but yeah, exactly. And that's the thing I forget, right? It's just not everybody's like me. We're all different. We all think differently, right? So yeah.
Yeah. And so that's why what I like to look at is these institutional patterns that are built into the strategy, and the game theory of the situation, because I think Adams had this thing about the Constitution, that if all men are angels, government would be unnecessary. Um, the systems that we build need to be independent of the sort of moral character of the people that are going to be running through them.
Sure.
You know, policing by consent doesn't work because criminals won't consent, and they're the ones that need to be policed. So those sorts of situations.
Yeah.
Now, where things get weird is that economics, properly speaking, is the sort of study of interactions where agreement is paramount, and that you can go too far with that, because disagreement is another aspect of human engagement, and politics is that one.
Yep.
So politics is sort of like how to disagree, economics is how to agree, and people have very simplistic ideas about what's possible within the field of agreement and disagreement. And it's a lot more sophisticated than that in each case. So even in a situation like economics, where everything is mutual agreement, there's still an enormous scope for mutually agreeing to different things and having those things be broadly beneficial or broadly harmful. And to go back to our basic example, having banks and homeowners mutually agree to take out loans based on trumped up valuations that would then be fed back into collateralized debt obligations, which the homeowners would invest into in order to increase their portfolio so they could buy new homes and keep the whole cycle going.
Yep.
Is essentially a long form Ponzi scheme.
Yeah. And it's happening in China too, or I don't know, has already happened just recently. What's the overall high level view of monetarily incentivizing people? Obviously the answer to that is, it works because the proof is there. But let's say you're taking a company, that's typically, you have your employees, private business that has employees, and you incentivize those people with equity, more money than they're typically making just to pay paycheck. Do you think that is a good incentive for people, or are there other things that come into that?
Well, again, we're seeing that actually starting to break down.
Okay.
With the new compensation plans. So the notion of changing executive compensation to be option and stock type compensation has shifted the focus of executives ever more towards financialization of their companies. And there's no strong evidence that that's actually improving things. In fact, what we've been seeing with the shift from the liquidity flow going to the housing market to now the stock and other sort of securities markets is things like stock buybacks, which again used to be considered fraud and were illegal.
Right.
So let's say I run company XYZ and my compensation is based on the differential stock price from year to year. So company XYZ is some reasonably operating blue chip that's got a global reach and is market dominant and consequently has a fantastic credit rating. So the government has crashed loan rates. So what do? I take my fantastic credit rating, I go borrow an enormous amount of money, and I buy XYZ stock on the market. What happens? Stock price goes up. What happened to the company? It took on an enormous amount of debt and it handed that cash over to random strangers. Maybe not even random strangers. What if I cashed in my my options and used those to sell? I took the company's credit card, I put it in my bank account, I jacked up the price of the thing that I was based on through no action of my own other than taking the company's credit card and jacking it into my bank account. And then my salary goes up.
Yeah.
Rinse and repeat. Is company XYZ getting any better at being the blue chip globally reach? Is that even relevant? What if, in addition to the company credit card, I also sold off some key assets for really good amounts of money to jack into my bank account? Now, that, that's all very obviously criminal.
Yeah. So, I mean, you have to
very close to that situation is being replicated across many of these companies.
Right. Right. And I guess that's where the lawyers come in, right? You need to draft that in a way and make it and communicate it, that those are the things that, I mean, a lot smarter people than me have done this stuff. I'm just saying that, yeah, no, that is an outcome that's not good.
Right. Well, that's not just an outcome that's not good. That's an outcome that's been happening for the last decade. The raise in the stock market, to some extent, has been buoyed by companies using their credit ratings to invest in bonds or other equities. There was an interesting case with Apple, where Apple was holding a lot of cash outside of America, so it couldn't be taxed. And because cash doesn't earn any money, they were buying sovereign bonds, including a lot of Swiss debt. Well, as it happened, the Swiss National Bank is also something of a sovereign wealth fund, and it was buying Apple shares. Enormous amounts of Apple shares. Approximately $10,000 worth of Apple for every citizen in Switzerland.
Holy lifting.
So we have a situation where a $1 trillion company is buying up the currency and debt of a sovereign nation, which is investing billions of dollars in that company.
Yeah.
Making both of them look more valuable. Was it collusion? Was it just a thing that happened? Was it just smart business practice that looks exactly like a collusion that just happened?
Yeah, that is the question, and we'll never know, but yeah.
So these sorts of issues come up essentially because of size. If Apple was a mom and pop pie shop that sold apple pies, if they decided to invest dozens of dollars in Switzerland, and Switzerland decided to invest dozens of dollars in them, it would have virtually no effect on the broader landscape. But because Apple is a blue chipish, global reachish company with $1 trillion credit line, their activities are relevant to the sovereign level of activity, and so you get these weird feedback loops that might be really disastrous or might be just fine, and that's where second and third and fourth and fifth level thinking become necessary. Like, is it reasonable to allow these sorts of relationships to even exist?
Yeah, I suppose. But then it gets difficult, because you can't eliminate people's ability to communicate, and where do you draw the line, I guess?
Right. And well, so that gets into the going back now to inflation. What's happening at base is the money supply is growing or shrinking. Money is the unit of account. It's basically the unit of measurement for this thing that we can't measure, i.e. the collection of 8 billion opinions around the world.
Mhm.
And again, thinking through the sort of multi-stage issues, if you harden the currency, so there's a fixed amount, there can be no other currency other than that currency, Bitcoin plus there's no credit market, something like that.
Sure.
What happens? Well, number one, population's increasing. We think it's going to keep increasing for at least a century. Might go on for longer than that.
Yes.
Monetary holdings would be in a fixed condition, be a fractional situation.
Right.
So you would control some fraction of the total currency pool. So if population's increasing, the fraction of the currency pool that would be held by the average person would go down automatically.
Yeah. Dilution, right?
Dilution from the other side, more
Yeah.
people. So
Whatever the words are. Yeah.
yeah. Which means that prices would have to come down,
Yes.
or people would start starving to death.
Well, the prices wouldn't come down, the value would go up, correct?
Well, so
Per dollar or whatever.
no, because it's fractionalizing. So people need to live.
Yes.
In order to live,
But if you're
food, shelter, water, power, clothing.
Okay. But hold on. So if there's 8 billion people, and that's just for simple numbers, there's $8 billion, and then they stop printing the 8 billion. The inflation, the amount of people goes up to 8.1.
Let's go bigger than that. Let's go to 12 billion.
Okay.
So let's say there's $8 billion, 8 billion people. People are doing one transaction a day. There's about $1 a day flowing around the system.
Okay. So then they print more
12
money.
billion people. No, they don't print more money.
Sorry, that's right.
We print another 50% people. So now there's 12 billion people.
Yes, that's what I meant.
They need to do a transaction a day.
So
there's only $8 billion.
Mm-hmm.
If they can only do $8 billion in transactions a day, they can only do 66 cents a day in transactions.
Yeah.
Prices have to come down, or transaction speed has to go up.
Well, wouldn't the value of the dollar be $1.33 though?
No, because the value of the dollar is measured in the goods and services and everything. And so if the 12 billion people are living approximately equivalent lives to the 8 billion people, those lives need to be cheap enough to be bought with 66 cents.
Okay.
Now, the other side of this is what if instead of doing one transaction for $1 per day, each person starts doing 1.5 transactions for $1 per day? And so $12 trillion of transactions happen, and there's still just only $8 billion flowing around.
Mm-hmm.
So that also has an effect. People could trade more quickly, create more real transactions, and you could get inflation that way.
Right.
And there's arguments about whether that kind of inflation is natural and good, or something else that would need to be altered in some way. So these questions are very open. Like, we don't know the answer to these things. We don't have good ways to measure them. In general, if prices weren't inflated and productivity was increased, which vast productivity increases have been the experience of the industrialized age, because basically we stop paying expensive people to do things and start getting cheap engines to do them instead. Mm-hmm. Prices would fall, and in some cases fall precipitously. For example, in the last generation, the amount of food per acre that's produced on Earth has gone up by a factor of something like 10.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Yeah. So,
so in a sort of flat world, we would expect that prices of food would absolutely crater.
no.
But
But
farmers vote,
yeah.
and uh, they're also deeply enmeshed in the credit system,
So
and their ability to pay those credits off is a foundational part of the banking sector. And there's not a lot of interest in seeing the price of bread crash, basically, because of that. And so that's a driving force
right.
in the concept of natural inflation, the idea that
Okay.
we'll just always grow so that the prices that we encounter on a day-to-day basis stay roughly the same. Now, of course, if you look at sort of any amount of history at all, you'll notice that in fact those prices have been exponentially increasing for decades, centuries.
Do you think there's some sociopaths saying, okay, well, people are going to need to eat, so we're going to maintain the price or increase the prices? But if you go to the Best Buy or whatever it is, look at a flat screen TV, I mean, the prices of those keep coming down like crazy. So what is it? What, so I mean, there's different. There's evergreen, and then there's things that people need, and then there's things that people want. And
well, that again, that gets to the whole UBI thing. So
right,
let's say everybody gets an extra $25,000 a year,
yeah,
and people need to eat. Why not charge them $25,000 or more a year for food?
right,
It's like they're going to starve.
yeah,
So like McDonald's and Kroger
yeah,
and those guys all jack up their prices by whatever the number is, and that's just how things are now. Of course, it wouldn't happen sort of quite as overnight as that, but
mm-hmm.
again, in the fullness of figuring out how to make money, we can very reasonably expect that to be exactly what happens.
Yeah, interesting. Do we have the capacity with technology we have today to simulate these things, either macro or micro economies?
We do.
Do we do it though?
Simulating the actual economy, on the other hand,
Okay, it's too many variables, or
not merely too many variables, which there absolutely are, but too chaotic a situation.
okay,
So, like I live in a university town. I've talked to people in the economics department. That the first sort of big famous flash crash, the E-minis flash crash, where so the back in 2010 was it? There was a big flash crash. The world sort of panicked for a little while. There was a lot of like
okay,
like the nightly news had a thing. CNN had people. It was like we were on the floor. We didn't know if it was going to keep going. Like, was this going to be 1929 all over again? And then
oh,
a couple minutes later, it bounced back up again. Um, there's some people that the information feed is available, so they bought the incoming information feed,
uh-huh.
and effectively what happened was a bunch of algorithms got themselves cross-grained, and they got stopped out, and they sort of a bunch of algorithms all started to say sell at exactly the same time. So these guys got the incoming feed and worked out what it was and built a simulation that crashed, on demand, and sort of, parameterized it and worked out like what people could have decided to do that would have made it so that thing didn't happen.
Right.
Uh, but that would be a little bit like building a simulation, like if your family pet ran out into the road and got run over by a car, and then you spent several years building a like Pixar level, recreation of the event so that you could watch in exact detail how it would have happened, and like move the pet back and forth to like get them to the point it does they're dead, it happens. It's so this technology does exist, affecting the future.
That's
like we don't really know how to do that.
We don't know what's going to happen.
And
okay, fair enough.
And sort of redissecting the past gets ghoulish after a certain period.
I see. Okay, well, I just figured there's some people out there doing this stuff. I don't know. Okay, I get it. Yeah. Well, because we can learn from the past, right?
Sure. Well, to some extent. One of the problems with learning from the past is that 8 billion opinions problem.
It's only
there's so much that's constantly happening, and what's happening now and what's going to happen is a result of all of those things.
Sure.
Yes. Even in a competitive situation, somebody's in charge and the other people are following along or working for them. If they're not on board, the NASA, when they were getting ready to land on the moon within the decade that JFK had challenged them to, was a very, very different organization than they were in the 80s when they blew up the Challenger.
Yeah.
The degree of mission and cohesion and everything else when they were doing the lunar launches was off the charts. That was one of the most effective and consequently impressive human accomplishments in all of history. And 15 years later, doing what they were claiming was so routine an operation that they could just sort of arbitrarily pick civilians and fold them in, had become so incompetent that they blew it up. And they blew it up because the people making the decisions to do these things could not communicate with the people who were actually doing them to learn what the consequences and risks of what was happening actually were. Because it's not like the engineers didn't know that that disaster was possible or even probable.
For sure, yeah.
Or even that the exact cause of that disaster would cause disasters exactly like that. Because they knew all of those things, that it was in all probability likely to happen because of the mechanisms that did exist. But the people making that decision didn't know any of those things.
No.
And so that's where you get into these sorts of disconnects. And that's where learning from history is very difficult, because again, human beings have a very narrative intensive focus.
For sure.
And a story about how this insane person who was doing something crazy, that we're attracted to that. Name a Roman emperor off the top of your head. Nero and Caligula are going to be a lot closer to the top of that list than Claudius or Tiberius or Augustus, because Claudius or Caligula and Nero have insane, crazy stories that stick in your mind.
Yeah.
So learning from history is difficult because you sort of don't get exposed to enough of it to sort of learn the whole lesson.
Yeah.
Um,
Information.
right. But that said, one of the things that we see happen over and over and over and over again in history is this kind of one-step thinking, or not carrying through things to scale,
Okay.
where people do something, it works out pretty well, and then they're like, well, that's the secret to the universe. And they just start replicating, and eventually you hit a wall.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty normal human behavior pattern, and it's tolerable at low scale. So if competition is a good mechanism for people who have that behavior pattern to operate under. What MBA classes have figured out is that for those people, it's an even better pattern not to be exposed to competition, so that you can just keep going until the universe finally, puts its foot on your neck.
That makes
because
sense.
the universe, the universe might not get around to punishing you until after you're dead. So it's all good at that point. Yeah. So what we generally focused on training our business leaders to do is to avoid competition at all costs. And so at the same time that we have started to sort of exalt the quality control mechanisms of the marketplace, we have abandoned those mechanisms. And so the people who are successful through our markets claim their success as a result of the capacities that used to exist before they got rid of them.
Oh man.
Wow. It'd be somewhat like if I changed the rules of competition so that I could win it, and then claimed that, like, the 100 meters is actually the 100 millimeters, and and therefore my world record is more impressive than Usain Bolt's, because 9.5 seconds, like, I can crush that. And by redefining the meter to be a millimeter.
Yeah.
And in fact, that's what's going on with inflation. Inflation, money is the unit of measurement of value. Inflation is the process of changing the size of the unit of measurement. And if people in the game are allowed to change the definitions of measurements, the merchant scale, let's say we're using, old form money, we're weighing it up, and I can change the definition of a pound. Then when I sell you cheese, a pound is an ounce. And when I'm figuring out, like, how much your silver is worth, a pound is a ton, and like, you need to bring me a ton of silver to buy a 1/4 ounce of cheese, because I'm giving you a ton of cheese and I'm getting an ounce of silver back. It's all fair. And the same thing for anything else. It's like, if hockey players could redefine what distances were, so that, the goalie can drop the puck and just be like, oh, it's in the other person's goal, because that's what distance means now. the game couldn't exist. And that's what we are seeing, with marketplaces having this sort of control over the supply of money. The financial industry can change the unit of measurement on a case-by-case basis. And so you can't deal with them under those circumstances.
What do you think about, these pharmacy companies and the governments working together, when it comes to providing vaccines and stuff like that? What do you think? Like, isn't there a word for that?
Yes, as my father likes to point out, fascism is the
Ah, yes.
term of use for government and corporate cooperation.
Yes. Yeah.
Uh, Government healthcare is very tricky.
Yeah. Yeah.
Healthcare itself is extremely tricky.
It is.
Healthcare has existed for millennia, but we discovered in the basically early 20th century that up until the early 20th century, it had been statistically worthless. So Florence Nightingale is sort of an excellent case. She was a deeply caring person who had very strong opinions about medical care, had gone to Crimea during the war in an attempt to make lives better,
Yeah.
had very vigorously and successfully politically routed large numbers of dead and dying soldiers to her facilities, and taken the sort of fame and acclaim from that after it was over, and devoted herself to the mathematics and learning sort of the early phases of statistical medicine, and sort of figuring out whether or not what you're doing is useful or useless, and essentially proved to herself that she had murdered many, many, many people, because what she was doing was not good and not worthless, but actively bad. And she had very, assiduously corralled as many people as possible into her actively bad operation as she could manage to scrape up. And she had a mental breakdown, and
Yeah, rightfully so.
you're talking about deathbed regrets. Imagine if you had a life mission that you believed that you had accomplished, and after you were done with it, you were, sat down and had explained to you step by step, learned yourself that what you were doing was evil.
Oh my gosh.
And that's she's not. It's sort of the most dramatic of these cases. She's not alone. Doctors did not think that they were quacks in the 1700s.
Conventional wisdom was almost always wrong. Yeah.
So we have been living for about a century in the age of scientific medicine.
Yeah.
But just in the last generation or so, the opioid expansion, other things like that, the replication crisis that has occurred in numerous fields of science, whether or not these things have had large or small impacts on the value of medical care isn't known yet, because we haven't actually done those studies, and there doesn't seem to be any money for doing them. But that, again, we're sort of coasting. We're acting as if medicine was the medicine of the scientific revolution, when medicine has become quasi-scientific. And while there's pretty decent evidence, life expectancies are a lot higher today than they were 50 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
We are starting to see some declines in life expectancy, which might be perfectly natural for any one of a wide variety of reasons.
Right. Is that statistically, or
statistically? Yes, and not across everything either. Like certain demographic groups are starting to decline, right, in America, and it's different in different places. Some places we don't really know. sub-Saharan Africa is growing so quickly that median ages are like in the mid-teens. So virtually everybody is, by reasonable standards, a child. So what's life expectancy there? Beats me. No old people. Can't really figure that out.
Yeah.
So the government is necessarily only capable of policy considerations at the macro level, because human beings don't, again, have the capacity to sort of individually consider every other person in an entire country. So from that perspective, a medical industry that is feeding into declining lifespans and greater self-reported life dissatisfactions, both of which have been the case for the last generation and a half-ish across most of the West, is not getting value for money. But what is the good way to pay for medical care under the presumption that medicine is a profession and thus not evaluatable by its customer base? That's a very, very difficult question. The classic sort of give and take and negotiation stance doesn't work if only one side is capable of understanding what's actually at stake.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's, man, good perspective on that. Thank you. Lots to think about. Give us something to think about until our next one. Or research, or whatever you want to say, because we're going to do another one.
Okay.
Because we haven't even scraped the surface, man. I mean, I don't know if we did even stay on topic. We did and we didn't, I suppose.
Yeah, there was some variation.
It was great. I loved it.
Okay. Well, the major thing is that with economics, you have to be aware of hubris, because it's so easy to learn and understand something and then decide that that thing is important or real, and
fair enough.
And it's very, very difficult for those things to keep being important or real at scale. And so taking that next step of like, so what if this got to scale? What if everyone was doing it? Does it still work? Like, does hygiene keep working? And does it work at sort of every layer of the onion? And that, to bring me back to sort of what I do, computer science and game theory gives us the ability to create infinitely recursive systems. And so we can describe, hopefully, systems that are simple enough for us to sort of think about and play around with, that also theoretically hold up to infinite scale and being used by many, many people. And the sort of brilliant and miraculous thing is that we really can cooperate with each other, at least sometimes, and people actually can trade instead of just murdering each other. It's not always the best idea that's out there, but it can be, and it's got a lot of advantages.
Cool, man. Beautiful. Well, thank you, Noah. Your time is always wonderful. It's a pleasure. I learned a lot, and I look forward to the next one.
Okay.
All right, man. Until next time, which will be probably a week or two.
Yes.
All right. And thank you again.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, man. Have a good weekend.